But what's particularly interesting is that these grafts have Lewy bodies. So these grafts were taken from fetuses, implanted into patients with Parkinson's, survived and functioned in the brain of patients with Parkinson's, but now they've acquired that inclusion that's the hallmark of Parkinson's. Somehow, the abnormal proteins have been deposited in these brain cells that are foreign to these patients. So somehow the grafts have acquired this disease. And that really does teach us something very, very important. We're transmitting this disease to the grafts, and how that happens and why it happens is going to be very critical to our understanding of the disease. One of the bigger breakthroughs that's happened in this field is the understanding that Parkinson's disease in at least some individuals is genetically determined. And we now recognize a number of forms of Parkinson's that come from a single or monogenetic disorder, single gene. And we're now, you probably, or you may or may not have heard of the various Parks. It started with Park 1 and now down to Park 13, believe it or not, and counting. And so each of these has been discovered as a genetic form of Parkinson's disease. They all work differently, and understanding how each of these are capable of inducing Parkinson's is going to be very critical. So when we think of cause of Parkinson's, we know that genetics is playing a role, but this is still a rather small proportion of the patients that I might see in a clinic. So we think that genetic Parkinson's may only account for maybe 2%, maybe up to 5% of normal Parkinson's disease. It depends on where in the world you are and what kinds of populations you care for. For example, in North Africa, it might be up to 40% of people with Parkinson's is genetically determined. So we don't know what the contribution of genetics is to what we would call sporadic, the typical Parkinson's disease that's occurring without an obvious gene. And what are the roles of various genes combined with environmental factors? We know that everybody hasn't injected bad heroin. We know that MPTP is not the cause for typical Parkinson's, but there must be some environmental factors, and how these environmental factors interact with the genes we're born with, we don't understand at this point. We know that age is a very critical factor. The disease increases with age. It's more common in men. It seems to be more common in people that have been exposed to certain pesticides and herbicides, but it's not a simple cause and effect kind of relationship. And it's also interesting to note that there are protective factors that we've been able to discover. There's a lower incidence of Parkinson's disease in people that smoke. So is smoking a protective factor of Parkinson's, or is it much more complicated than that? We're not encouraging our patients to smoke, obviously. Smoking is much worse for you than saving you from Parkinson's disease. Caffeine, uric acid, the substance that causes gout, high uric acid somehow seems to be associated with a lower incidence of Parkinson's disease. And estrogen levels, a lower incidence of Parkinson's, and maybe some protective genetic factors. So we're now thinking that maybe we're not dealing with a single disorder. It's more likely that we're dealing with various different types of disorders that can all add up to cause it. And I think we're now thinking of Parkinson's diseases rather than a single disorder. Now let's look at what happens in what we think is happening in the brain in Parkinson's. We have genes, various different ones, and environmental factors. These somehow cause abnormal biochemical changes and cellular changes, which then result in the formation of that Lewy body inclusion. These changes then somehow go on to neuronal injury and death, with the loss of the black substance of the brain and the loss of the dopamine cells that then result in symptoms. So you can imagine that the symptomatic therapy deals with the last stages. You've already got your symptoms. The neurorestoration, implanting cells, causing cells to grow, affect this stage. But what we'd really like to develop is treatment that prevents this cascade of events that ends up causing the neurodegenerative process. And you can imagine we might do that at many different steps depending on the process. So some of the priorities in our field are to understand the various causes, to understand how those causes come together to damage nerve cells. We'd like to be able to develop markers for the disease. Wouldn't you like to know, those of us that don't have Parkinson's, if you're predisposed to developing it, or know way in advance of having the symptoms of Parkinson's that you could get it, so then you could take whatever new neuroprotective therapy might be available. And we think of these markers, these biomarkers, as what we call trait biomarkers, you have the disease, or state biomarkers, how severe is your disease, how advanced has the disease progressed. We'd like to use all of this above knowledge to develop therapies that would prevent the disease from progressing and getting worse. And we'd like to apply this effective neuroprotective therapy to people that we find are predisposed. So it's not too much science fiction to think that eventually you'll be able to go to your pharmacy, have a little blood test, you'll be able to find out what likelihood you would be to develop Parkinson's disease, and you'll take your pill that would prevent it from ever coming out in the first place. So that's the goal in this field. We know that Parkinson's disease and many neurodegenerative diseases gradually progress, and it's many years before you will develop the shaking and the slowness and the stiffness. And it's likely that way because there's a critical threshold that you have to get below. Your cells have to have been lost to maybe 50%. You've got 50% freedom before you gradually develop the symptoms of Parkinson's. So you can imagine that with time your cells would gradually be lost with normal aging, but Parkinson's must be some sort of accelerated process, and this is a theoretical natural history of the cell loss that you gradually get down to that critical threshold. This is when the patient begins to show symptoms, but this is when the degenerative process started. So you can think of there being what we call a preclinical period from this point through maybe many years, 10, 15, 20 years possibly, before the patient might develop symptoms. And this is going to be the critical time that we'd like to define who's going to get the disease and be able to prevent it from coming out in the first place. And we also now recognize from very careful studies that there are some symptoms that come before the development of the slowness and the stiffness and the shaking. So we know that people have constipation years before the development. They lose their sense of smell way before the development of the other features. They may have disturbances of sleep with what's called rapid eye movement sleep behavior disorder. They may act out their dreams and be very active in sleep. Depression and anxiety may predate the development of Parkinson's by many years. And then there are some other suggested links, but there's very strong evidence that each of these are advance the symptoms of Parkinson's by many years. This is an interesting study where a group in Spain took biopsies from bowel cancer patients and prostate cancer patients. So these are people who had their bowels removed or their prostate removed by surgery. None of them had Parkinson's disease. And the researchers stained the tissue in the bowels and the prostates for the alpha-synuclein protein, which is the primary protein in the Lewy body. And indeed, they found in 100 patients undergoing abdominal pelvic surgery, 9% of the whole sample, more in the prostate than in the digestive tract, had these changes that suggested these individuals could be predisposed to developing Parkinson's years later. Whoop, going the wrong way. So, this is a cartoon that was created by a colleague of mine, Bill Langston. He was the one that actually discovered MPTP. You heard his name in the videotape. And he's emphasized, among a number of others, including myself, that Parkinson's is a very complex disorder that can present to many different physicians. An ear, nose, and throat specialist because the person complains of loss of sense of smell. The sleep doctor because of the sleep disturbances. The psychiatrist due to depression. The autonomic specialist that concentrates on blood pressure and bladder difficulties. The gastroenterologist because of the constipation. So I, as a neurologist, may see only a small part of the patients at the earliest stages. And you can imagine if all of these symptoms predate the Parkinsonism, that patients are going to see their doctors for a variety of other things first.